Hello.
Hey, Vera, how are you?
Good.
Here's a song for you.
How much time would you like?
Give me 3 minutes. Your hair looks good. What's up with that?
Oh, thanks. I actually put it in braids, which you're supposed to do like all the time.
Cool.
Protect it. Okay. Okay. Okay, here comes everyone.
Great. Hey, everybody. Hi. How you doing? It's been a sorry, I have a I actually have COVID at the moment. The truth is, but I'm fine. I mean, it's pretty light.
Oh my God.
Ellie, hi. So so pardon me if I cough a little bit through this, but and one other technical thing, someone's asking about the passcode, Vera, the meeting ID or something like that. Someone's texting me about this.
Oh, let me check on that. I don't know what that is.
Okay. All right. We've been off for a couple weeks, and so I can see the group is a little smaller. You break and then you lose your crowd. But when we last left the Mishnah, we were in tractate Eruvin, meaning the Eruv, the boundary that is constructed to allow us to carry on Shabbat, and from a private place into a public place, or from a public place into a private place, or actually the idea of the Eruv is that it turns a public place into a private place, right? So not allowing you to break Shabbat, but actually creating a new reality in which you're not breaking Shabbat. And we talked about the idea of the loophole and whether this really is just a loophole. And we talked about why we would want to construct such a loophole. What is it about being able to create a community, a shared community within a particular place, and to transport goods from one house to another? Let's say for a Shabbat meal, to bring cookies to your neighbor. What are the values behind that? Why do the rabbis go through, if it is a loophole, why do they go through that loop? What is important about the Eruv? And we did, I think, some really good work last time thinking about what it means to construct the boundaries of community. Eruvin, the tractate, is all about how you do that, and it's very technical, very, very technical, and very famously difficult. So, I'm tempted to just move on, because we did the good work, and now you could just get lost in the details. It's important for us to talk about major Jewish institutions like the Eruv, but the details are probably beyond the scope of this class. So I thought about maybe just leaving Masechet Eruvin, that's tractate Eruvin, behind. But there is one more important concept that comes up in Eruvin that I think it's worth us discussing, because I think of this class, I've said this a number of times, this class is about building your hardcore Jewish knowledge, really just trying to gather that kind of crunchy Jewish knowledge, that Jewish knowledge that isn't the first level, but maybe just the next level of Jewish knowledge. And I think the study of the Mishnah is one of the best ways to do that. So the concept that I want us to consider before we leave Eruvin behind is a concept called Techum Shabbos. Techum Shabbos, the boundary of Shabbat. What is the boundary of Shabbat? So let me start here. There are actually 3 uses of the concept of an Eruv on Shabbat, and we, last time we met 3 weeks ago now, just studied the most famous of them, which is Eruv Chatzerot. Okay, the word Eruv means a blending. Okay. In fact, the word for evening is Erev, because it's the blending between day and night. Okay. So Eruv is a mixing, a blending, and Eruv Chatzerot is the mixing of many courtyards. So every house has a courtyard, but if we mix them together, then we have like a shared courtyard. That's the idea behind Eruv Chatzeros. Okay. Then there's one, I'll mention quickly, one Eruv that doesn't come up in this tractate, and that's Eruv Tavshilin, the mixing of foods, and that's when you have a holiday, a festival that follows after Shabbat, and you want to be able to prepare some of the food for the festival on Shabbat, but you're not allowed to prepare food for the festival on Shabbat. You're not allowed to prepare on Shabbat. And so you make some food before Shabbat that counts as Shabbat food that you mix together with the food that you're going to prepare for the holiday. And in parentheses, let's just forget about that one. We're not going to discuss that one in depth because it doesn't come up in this tractate. But the third Eruv in our lexicon is Eruv Techum, the mixing of boundaries, or the mixing together of Shabbat boundaries. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about today. And I say this is like crunchy Jewish knowledge. I remember talking to someone about a debate they were having, like kind of a not a debate, but a sort of a challenge with someone who knows more like arcane Jewish concepts. And he said he won on Techum Shabbos. Techum Shabbos is like, it is a hallmark Jewish concept, but it's not one that comes up too often, as opposed to the Eruv of courtyards, the Eruv Chatzerot, that we are familiar with. That's become a very practical, very usable concept in our contemporary Jewish lives. The city of Los Angeles has an Eruv. Many cities have an Eruv. Many cities want an Eruv. It's the famous Eruv. Eruv Techum is less famous because it is less necessary, because it deals with just how far you can walk on Shabbat. Okay, just how far you can travel on Shabbat, and that's going to be our concept today. So let's say a blessing. I'm going to bless us with healing. I need some healing today. Anyone who's in need of healing, may our Torah learning be a force of healing for us. So let's say a blessing over our study, and then we'll begin. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so let's start here. Techum Shabbos, the boundary of Shabbat. The boundary of Shabbat is that, now this is not carrying. You cannot carry out of any private place into a public place, even within the city, unless you have an Eruv, the first kind of Eruv that we talked about. But now I'm just talking about just walking. And there is an idea that you are not allowed to travel outside of maybe a city is the wrong word, a settlement, a town, a city, a community. You cannot wander too far outside of the community on Shabbat. Okay. Well, how far? So how far can you wander? Well, the rabbis tell us that you can wander to the edge of the city plus 2,000 cubits, which is about, I think, about a kilometer. 2,000 cubits. Let me show you just a picture of that before we look at texts. So here, this is just on the Wikipedia page for Techum Shabbat. And this is what it looks like. Here's the city. And then the rabbis say, in order to calculate, we also give the city an extra rectangular border. We don't do it from the actual boundary lines of the city, but here's the city. And then around the city, we imagine a rectangular border. And then from that rectangular border, we can go 2,000 cubits in any direction, okay? So that means to the edges of this, and as you can see, in the corners, that even means a little bit extra because of the, what do you call it? What's the word for the line that cuts across the square? Somebody knows it. Okay, so this turquoise area is the Techum of Shabbat, the boundary. So if you're here, or let's say if you're here, you can leave the city to go for a walk, but you can only go so far, okay? You can only go to the edge here. Okay, let's just start. I'm going to set up all the key pieces, and then we'll try to think a little bit about the why. Well, why is this important? Why do the rabbis want to kind of keep us in one locale on Shabbat? Well, part of the answer is the rabbis will claim that the Torah itself suggests that we ought to stay put on Shabbat, that we ought to stay in one place on Shabbat. So let me give you a source sheet, and we'll start to look at some of the basics. These sources, some of them we saw last time we learned, because the idea here, the spirit of staying in one place also informs the other Eruv that we looked at, the not transporting goods from one place to another. It's also founded on this general principle of staying put on Shabbat. So here's a source sheet for today. Let's see. Okay, here's a source sheet for today. Now, the rabbis tell us here in the Talmud that the 2,000 cubits, if you were to ask them, where'd you get this number? Where does it come from? Well, they use this verse, and we saw this verse before last week. And this verse here in the book of Exodus comes up in the story of the manna that falls from the sky. And it falls from the sky. That's how the Israelites were fed in the desert, and they got manna from the sky every day, but they would get 2 portions on the 6th day. Mark that it is the Eternal who, having given you the Sabbath, therefore gives you 2 days food on the 6th day. Okay, so it seems like the intention here is you're going to get 2 portions of food on the 6th day so that you don't go out gathering food on the 7th day. Okay, so why is that? What don't we want to be doing on the 7th day? Well, you could come up with lots of answers. We don't want to be collecting. We don't want to be working. We don't want to be providing for ourselves. But the second part of the verse also seems to indicate that the Torah doesn't even want us going out that far on Shabbat. And that's why we have this language, let everyone remain where they are. Let no one go out of his place on the 7th day. Okay. So you can see how this verse becomes an anchor for both the concept of transporting goods from the public to the private, and also in this last phrasing here, it seems to suggest that actually you ought to just stay where you are on Shabbat. But what about those 2,000 cubits? I just said an Eruv is 2,000 cubits, or about 1 kilometer, a little more than 1 kilometer, beyond the boundaries of a city. So these 2,000 cubits, where are they written in the Torah? The Talmud asks, and the Talmud says, well, we can learn this from the doubled phrasing of the verse, because the verse says, let everyone remain where they are. These are 4 cubits. Let no one go out of his place. These are the 2,000 cubits. So let everyone remain where they are. That's 4 cubits. Let no one go out of his place on the 7th day. That's 2,000 cubits. Now, if you're feeling suddenly like completely lost, that is perfectly understandable. Where do we even come up with 4? Okay, so let's start there. The rabbis have a general concept that a person, a human being, has personal space. And their personal space, that is that unit which defines their general kind of what they need to simply exist as a human being, is 4 cubits. Right? If you didn't have any room to move, you would be suffocated as a human being. And so every human being starts with a kind of defining amount of personal space that is 4 cubits. Okay, you just have to accept that as one of the basic rabbinic units of measurement. 4 cubits. Everybody has 4 cubits of space, and the rabbis will use that in all kinds of ways. What is the minimum amount of space that you need to build a house or a sukkah? Or what is your personal space? It's 4 cubits big. So the rabbis say, that verse says, let everyone remain in their place. Well, that's a minimum. You have to stay within your 4 cubits on Shabbat. But that's very, very small. So then the verse doubles and says, and let no one leave their place on Shabbat. And so the rabbis say that must be extra. And the extra measurement that they assign to it is 2,000 cubits. Now, again, if none of this makes sense to you, you're still perfectly, you're in perfectly good company, because the truth is, then the Talmud goes on and says, wait, how did you learn that from the Torah? Is that really, where did you get the idea of 2,000 cubits? And in the end, there's a debate. And some of the rabbis say, nah, there's no real source for this. We came up with this, and then we're using this verse as a support for the general idea that, you shouldn't wander too far on Shabbat. And we picked these numbers. We picked the number 2,000, right? Okay, so some rabbis will say, no, we have a tradition from Moses, 2,000 cubits. And other rabbis will say, no, we just wanted to come up with a general boundary line for just how far you could go on Shabbat, and it's 2,000 cubits. Okay, there's a lot of information right up front. So let me just pause here. And I'd like to do a little bit of the work that we often do at this class, which is not just to get the nuts and bolts knowledge, but to think a little bit about why that would be. Why would, do you think, let's assume for a moment that they just came up with this number, right? And in a sense, just came up with this concept that not only can you not leave, not only should you stay in your city, or I should say it differently, this concept that you should stay in your city plus a little bit extra, okay? That you have a certain boundary line of space that you can move about on Shabbat, but you can't go too far. So let's just stop here. And I'd just like to hear if anyone has a sense of why is it important to stay in one's place on Shabbat? Why is it important? Why can't I go for a 10-mile walk on Shabbat? And by the way, I could if the city was 10 miles across, but I can't go 10 miles outside of the city. Why is that important? So let's start with Gary.
My understanding that the two values it's supporting is Oneg Shabbat, the joy of Shabbat, and Shabbat Menuchas, Shabbat rest. And that the point being, if it was a determination that anything excess with that would diminish our Oneg Shabbat or would diminish our rest on Shabbat.
Beautiful, beautiful, perfect answer, probably the best answer. Isn't Shabbat about rest? Certainly you can't take a marathon-like trek on Shabbat because that like at a certain point, it just starts to disrupt the general feeling or atmosphere of Shabbat, which is to sit and be as you are. The word Shabbat seems to mean sitting in place, right? So in some ways, it's just obvious. Of course, you shouldn't travel too far on Shabbat. That contrary, even though it's not so obvious from the verse exactly how far that should be, we have to come up with some limit, because if you could walk 50 miles on Shabbat, at a certain point, that just wouldn't feel like Shabbat. Okay, anything else surfacing for people? Anything else that feels like important to mention before we start talking about the extensions? Yeah, Joni.
Hi, Rabbi Kesher. Hope you
Hi.
feel good soon.
Thank
Somehow I feel like I don't know where it is, but I need your help, that it's somehow tied to safety, that somehow I can't leave my tribe. There's something about Shmot, there's something about being in the desert, receiving the extra manna, and there's some kind of warning there.
Good, really good, Joni. So Gary gave us the best straightforward answer, and Joni is giving us a little bit of a communal value. There's a suggestion here of a communal value, of communal solidarity. And Joni's right that some of the stories in the Torah, particularly there's a story of a man who goes out, who's found wandering collecting wood on Shabbat. And it seems to be a great outrage, and eventually he's killed. What is the great outrage? I mean, he's broken Shabbat, but it seems to be that the story itself, again, this is not a precise derivation for a law, but Joni's right that there's a feeling there that this person has left the community. They've just, this person doesn't see themselves as tied to the community. And to build on Joni's thought, it therefore seems that part of the whole concept of an Eruv, of a boundary line that brings a community together, is that the community should be together on Shabbat. Okay, the Torah never says that exactly, but there's a sort of suggestion that we shouldn't wander too far away from the community. We should be with the community on Shabbat. Okay, so there we have now both a technical answer and a kind of spiritual answer, and let's keep both of those in mind as we move forward. Okay, we'll take one more reflection before we start looking at the loophole of the day. Let's hear from Kathy.
Well, really, it was a kind of expansion that you were kind of going into from Joni's. It's not, I see it not just as safety, but a kind of, sort of a fear-based thing, but really that sort of sense that the community needs to be together and that it's just not a good thing. Maybe not unsafe, but just, that there's this need for the community to be limited and everything. And so I guess I see a lot of the laws, like kashrut, I feel like that's one of the big reasons, you don't really want to encourage people to eat at other people's houses who don't share the same rules. And so, that there's that, it's both positive and negative. I guess that's what I'm saying too, and in terms of the limitations, but the limitations are all over the place, not just, here.
Good. Okay. Right. So, Kathy at once builds on Joni's suggestion that and tells and reminds us there are all sorts of boundary lines that are drawn around communal solidarity that first of all embody a kind of value, but also seem to, Kathy's saying, seem to suggest a certain kind of anxiety that maybe there's a danger in getting too far away from the community. There's something that you might be in danger, or the community might be endangered if too many people are transgressing, in this case, a literal boundary line, but there's all kind like marriage boundaries and eating boundaries. And this might be a general anxiety that, I don't know, who has the Torah / the rabbi / Jewish tradition / just human beings and their, their anxieties that exists in our tradition. And we will, good. I'm glad that you mentioned that, Kathy, because we're going to see questions. At one point you said safety. We're going to see questions of safety emerge in our discussion as well. Okay, now, so we have the concept of Techum Shabbat, the boundary of Shabbat. That's, like I said, that's your crunchy Jewish knowledge for today. But now, second level of crunchy Jewish knowledge is the Eruv Techumin, the mixing of one boundary with another boundary. And the idea here is that you have 2,000 cubits in any direction, but you are allowed, the rabbis decide, to extend your 2,000 cubits by another 2,000 cubits in one direction. Okay, you can make your boundary line longer on one of the sides. And we'll soon see why you might want to do that. But this is, as I said, it's not a very, it would be hard enough for me to walk out of Los Angeles on Shabbat, right? So I'm usually not even worried about the first 2,000 cubits, let alone another 2,000 cubits. It doesn't come up that often, but the rabbis felt that there was a need to give a little extra wandering room on one side of the square. And the way that you do that is the same way that you did that with the Eruv Chatzerot, the way that you joined courtyards together. And do you remember how that was? You join courtyards together by designating a piece of food as one may mix and join with anything but water and salt. Okay, now we read this last week to mean that you can use any kind of food. It can't be water and salt because that's just too basic, but you can use any meat or cookies or bread or fruit you can use to join courtyards together. In the case of Eruv Chatzerot, that meant if you take a cookie, a cake, and you put it in one of the households or the courtyards, and you designate that as shared food, then that joins all the courtyards together. Now, that in itself is sort of an interesting, I don't know how much time we spent, I don't think we spent a lot of time last time reflecting on why it is that food is the substance which creates a mixture or a joining together. But it is also true, remember that it said here, everything can be joined. One may mix and join, okay? And actually in the Hebrew, it's probably better if I say everything can be mixed and joined with anything but water and salt. This everything, the rabbis understand to mean this applies both to the Eruv of courtyards and also to the Eruv of boundaries. And we're not going to get too deep into the technicalities, but in short, what that means is you take a piece of food and you transport it before Shabbat to some place 2,000 cubits outside of the boundary. You can put it under a tree there, or maybe you've got a shack out there, and you put the piece of food there, and now that food extends your boundaries another 2,000 cubits. So now I just asked, why food? What is it about food that creates this either a joining of households or an extension of your domain? And I think the answer, I'll invite other interpretations, but I think the answer is that in this case, food is serving as a way to establish residence. When you are eating somewhere, you are living there, you exist there. And so even though the settlement is really defined by the boundaries of the city, if there's a piece of food out there, it's like human life is still moving far from the city, and that extends the city even further. I should say, well, what does it mean to define a city and its boundaries to begin with? And the rabbi's answer to that, again, these are all, they're not arbitrary measurements, but they're measurements the rabbis come up with. And the rabbis say, as long as there are 70 cubits between one house and another, that's still the city. So you get to the outskirts of the city where the housing is less dense, but as long as the next house is still 70 cubits and the next house is still 70 cubits, that still defines the boundary of the city. But as soon as you get to the place where it's 71 cubits to the next house, the city has ended, okay? That's the edge of the city, okay? And then you have 2,000 cubits to walk, but you can extend that to 4,000 cubits on the other end, okay? So that's Eruv Tchumin, and it almost never comes up, but the idea of Tchum Shabbat does come up because there are cases in which we might see ourselves as restricted from traveling. Let's say you're in a small city. This might actually come up. The walk that you go on might be too far outside the city and therefore a violation of Shabbat. Okay. So that's the idea of Eruv Tchumin, of mixing 2,000 cubits with the next 2,000 cubits on one side. Very strange law. The rabbis have these, it's all strange, but like the rabbis have a definition of what a city is, and then they have a definition of a boundary outside the city, and then it can go in one direction. And at this point, we might ask the question, why? Why is it so important to have an extra bit of space on one side? Okay, so now let's consider some of the reasons. Now here's where things start to get really interesting. The rabbis are going to consider some of the reasons why you might want an extension of space. Okay, so here we're going to finally head into the Mishnah for today. And this is an interesting Mishnah, not just because it'll surface for us some of the concerns, some of the reasons why you might want extra traveling space, but it also makes clear that one of the things you need for an Eruv is a piece of food, something very practical and substantial. But another thing that is necessary for an Eruv, and this is an important point, is intention. You have to, part of what it means to place your food there is that you've set an intention for this to be your direction. Because remember, you only get one direction. Okay, I think that's a boy band, isn't it? One Direction. Okay, so let's take a look here. This is just the next couple of cases just describe the various possibilities for extending your Eruv. So let's take a look. A person may make a condition with regard to his Eruv. So you have you are going to extend in one direction, but you can make a condition and say, if enemy nations come from the east, my Eruv is in the west. Okay, if marauders, bandits come from the east, then I have 4,000 cubits to the west. If they come from the west, my Eruv is in the east. If they come from both sides, I will go wherever I wish. And if they do not come at all, neither from here nor from there, I will be like the rest of the inhabitants of my town. Okay, so to be clear, this presumes you've done the work. You've set up a little piece of food on every side of the boundary line. You could go east, you could go west, but you make a condition. You're only allowed to go one, but you make a condition and you say, I hereby set the intention, having designated the food on either side, that my Eruv will, my extra 2,000 cubits, my Eruv Tumin will go in the direction I need it to go. So if there's danger in the east, my Eruv is suddenly in the west. If there's danger in the west, my Eruv is suddenly in the east. And take note, if there's danger on both sides, I can pick. And if there's no danger, then I don't use the Eruv. Okay? And I'll be like the rest of the inhabitants of my town, suggest to us that you actually ideally should not be extending your Eruv. Okay, so one reason, we're starting to see one reason why you might extend your Eruv. Let's take a look at another, and then we'll try and reflect on what the concerns are here. That was a negative reason. Here's a positive one. If a sage comes from the east, some great scholar is coming in from the east, my Eruv is in the east. If he comes from the west, my Eruv is in the west. If one sage comes from here and another sage comes from there, I will go wherever I wish. And if no sage comes neither from here nor from there, I will be like the rest of the inhabitants of my town. Okay, so now this is a positive reason. It's a little confusing because what's this sage is a great scholar, but what's he doing traveling on Shabbat? But do the math, and you can imagine that there's a city here and there's a city there. They each extend 2,000 cubits. They meet in the middle, and that piece of food, maybe the sage has put a piece of food also, or maybe they're sharing a piece of food, allows the sage to cross over another 2,000 cubits and allows you, who wants to go, presumably, I don't know, to greet the sage, to welcome him, to provide him safe escort. So I'm going to place food, and if a scholar is coming to the east, I will be allowed to go to the east, and if a scholar comes to the west, I'll be allowed to go to the west. Same sorts of conditions. Okay, and then one final condition here is a bit of a limitation, which is that Rabbi Yehuda said if one of these sages was his teacher, he may only go to his teacher, and if they were both his teachers, he may go wherever he wishes. Okay. I said that Eruvin is very hard because the logic gets very dizzying. So, I keep apologizing for just how slippery all of this is. But let's just try to map out these cases and then to figure out what's going on. I have the right to one extra extension of space. In cases of danger, I can pick which direction that is, the opposite of the danger. In cases of excitement and joy, I can extend my direction in the direction of the honored sage, right? So these are some. Let's try to speak out. What are some of the concerns that? Let's go back to our original question. Why did the rabbis think you needed some extra space? Why are the rabbis worried or concerned that 2,000 cubits all around wouldn't be enough? Sometimes you need a little extra space. So let's try to imagine for a moment the world that the rabbis were living in and the sort of environment that affected their sense that sometimes you need a little extra space. Okay. So, Yael.
Well, this isn't terribly profound, but one thing that I experienced was if you have family that lives outside of your Eruv, but you want to spend Shabbat with them, or you want to spend Shabbat afternoon with them, or even friends, or a rabbi who's come for the Shabbat and is making a shiur. So that's something that's really tangibly useful. So it wouldn't keep relatives apart for the Shabbat, especially if that's their only day off.
Good. Okay, exactly right. And thank you for, yeah, as you said, it's not profound, but someone needs to state not the obvious, but the reality on the ground. Right? Remember when we were talking about the Eruv Chatzerot, what we said was that it would be a shame if nobody could share food with their neighbors on Shabbat. Surely the people who live 3 houses down from you ought to be able to share in your Shabbat experience. And so we come up with this institution, which allows us to see our, and part of what we said last time was it allows us to see our movement into the public as a shared private space. But the truth is, and that feels like a loophole, but the truth is, it really does feel like private space when you're that close to another neighbor. And so in a way, the whole purpose of an Eruv is to acknowledge the human reality where technically, if you were going to be technical and strict about terms like what is private and what is public, then you'll be locked off from your neighbors. But we have to acknowledge the human reality where you really are in the same space and the same community. And so the Eruv allows you to feel that way. So similarly, Yael says, you cannot leave your settlement. But what if there is another settlement just over the borderline, right? But it's not just over the borderline, because in those days, I grew up in Oakland, right? So Oakland to Berkeley, right? Those are adjacent cities, and I have walked from Oakland to Berkeley on Shabbat. But I'm walking from Oakland to Berkeley because, those are my neighbors as well, just as much as the Oakland neighbors 3 houses in that direction, so the Berkeley neighbors 3 houses in that direction. But that's not a problem because there's house from Oakland to Berkeley. According to the laws, that isn't actually a break in cities. But in ancient times, a settlement would be far from another settlement, at least 70 cubits far. So sometimes it would be 4,000 cubits far, but you still want to be able to visit your friends in Berkeley on Shabbat. So this extends it not infinitely, but a reasonable distance so that you can visit the communities around you. Okay, great. That's good fleshing out of what we're seeing here. Let's continue to see what folks are observing. Regina?
So in terms of the sage and visiting friends or relatives, that would seem to enhance the spirit of Shabbat. So that would be a positive thing. One thing these are all for personal needs. One thing I thought about is somebody's outside of your Eruv, who is alone and you want to bring into the community. That would serve to help that person. Maybe they have needs or they don't have a community, and you could reach out to them in some way, and be able to extend, go beyond.
That's right. That's good, Gina. I'm thinking about like 2 big settlements, but right. Maybe this sage is a hermit. Maybe this sage lives way out in the forest, like many of the legends of the sages that live way out on the outskirts of the city, and comes in on Shabbat to give a teaching, right? So it allows for those who are actually not in community to join in community, because that person has 2,000 cubits and then another 2,000 cubits, and you can go and bring them into community. Great. And Marilyn.
Well, yeah, it's all along the same lines. I have to admit, this seems this makes so much sense to me. I don't find this dense. If an enemy is coming from one side, you have permission to that's a little close. I think I'll be over there. I don't want to have stress. And again, it's what Gary mentioned. You're supposed to have joy. You're supposed to rest. It's easier to rest if you can be a little bit further from your enemy. And the way it is, yes, if they're coming this way, go that way, this way, that way. If they're both coming, I get to choose. And if neither are coming, yes, I should stay. It makes total sense. And with the sage, it's the opposite. If they're coming, I can go. So it is in the spirit of Shabbat. And like you say, it gives you that loophole that's not totally extended, but extended enough not to give you stress on this day of something that would bring you joy.
Okay, excellent. That is very well put. And Marilyn says it makes sense to her because, again, this is just sort of it's a reasonable, practical acknowledgement of basic human concerns. And I think that one way to look at this whole Eruv institution, I think Marilyn saying something very similar, is that it's about acknowledging the human reality and trying to be understanding and practical and accommodating to basic human needs. I mean, you got to flee from an enemy. Surely you're allowed to go in the other direction to flee from an enemy. That just makes sense. Okay, so that's one end of the Eruv conversation, is what just makes sense. But now I want to flip to the other side and look at some of the formulations around this traveling space that seem not so accommodating, not so practical. Okay, so here's another formulation that comes up in the next chapter of the Mishnah. Of what happens when you're outside of the Eruv. Okay, if enemy nations came and seized someone on Shabbat and took him beyond the Shabbat limit, or if an evil spirit took him out, and an evil spirit, I think, is usually understood to mean kind of an insanity. You lose your mind for a minute. Something comes over you, and you're temporarily mentally not functioning. So either you're seized, kidnapped, and taken outside of the Shabbat boundary, or you are sort of going crazy and you wander outside of the Shabbat boundary. Okay. And then, either I guess the kidnappers just leave you there, or you regain your sanity. So if that is the case, you only have your 4 cubits. You cannot travel at all outside of the boundary of Shabbat. Okay. If they bring you back, then no problem. You can just walk around. It's not like you're locked in forever. But if they take you and dump you in the middle of the wilderness, the law is you should just stay put where you are. Okay. So that is very extreme. Like here's a stricture, an extreme formulation that says, if through some circumstance beyond your control, you end up far outside of the boundary of Shabbat, here's where we start to see that there really are strictures. You just have to stay where you are until Shabbat is over. Just stay right there. It doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem accommodating. It doesn't seem nice, but that's the rule. However, and here we get into a bit of a debate. What if instead of just dropping you in the middle of nowhere, if they, another typo here, if they brought him to a different city or put him into a pen or a stable? That is 2 situations in which, excuse me, 2 situations in which there are boundaries or walls around you. Again, a certain definition of a settlement. Then Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah say he may walk about the entire city, whereas Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Akiva say he has only 4 cubits. Okay, so let's just try to understand this debate here. If you're cast out into the middle of nowhere, you're stuck. You can't move. I'm not sure we would like that law, but that's the law. You can't move. But if they take you from one city and then drop you into another city, you can behave just as you would in the first city. You walk all the way around the city. But some of the sages say, no, you have to, if you're taken out of your original Shabbat residence and move to another Shabbat residence, or you go crazy and you end up there, you're suddenly locked in just as you would be if you were in the wilderness. Okay. Now, let's just try to understand, what is the debate here? What are they arguing over? If we could try to boil down the debate, if you're dropped into another city, some of the rabbis think same thing. You just walk around in the city, whereas other rabbis think you have to stay put as if you were in the wilderness itself. What's the debate? Let's think about it for a sec. What defines a residence here? How do you define your place of residence? We talked about this a little bit earlier. Food can establish your residence somewhere. So what's the difference between the sages who say you can walk around a new city if you're kidnapped and put into a new city. And the other sages who say, no, if you're taken out of your city, you're stuck where you are. Okay. So I think the debate is that it's a question of what exactly is the definition. It's a classic rabbinic debate. It's a kind of ontology. Like, what is your residence? What is your Shabbat residence? Is it defined by the place, or is it defined by the person? Hefsa or Gavra, as they say in yeshiva language. Is it defined by the place in which you established residence? You decided, this is where I am on Shabbat. The idea that you have to stay put on Shabbat, is that defined by your intention, or is it defined by the place itself? Does your environment, your external circumstances, is that what creates a sense of residence, or do you create it by intending to be somewhere on Shabbat? And the rabbis are debating which of these is really the foundation of Shabbat residence. Because if any city serves as a residence, then it doesn't matter where you're dropped in. But if your residence on Shabbat, if it's really about, I said I would be here and I have to be here, and anywhere else I am is not my residence, then you have freedom of movement where you established your residence. But if you find yourself stuck in some other place, you are indeed stuck there. Okay, Randy or Leah.
For me, this is about what Shabbat is. It seems to be a common agreement that for the 27 hours or so, we are in a state of perfection and nothing needs to be adjusted or changed. So if we're magically or supernaturally or through a bad airline connection dropped into what I will call a foreign space, that for me would be very that would disturb the common agreement that we are in a state of perfection because it's Shabbat. We could not find that perfection in the new foreign space.
Good. Very, very well said. Very, very helpful, very incisive comment from Leah. And I think that's right. I think what we're seeing here, and we saw it in the last Eruv conversation, and we're seeing it again in this one, is that there is a tension in Shabbat in general between the kind of perfect, idealized, spiritual state of perfection, of rest, of bliss, of tranquility on the one hand, which Shabbat is supposed to create, but create through its sort of arbitrary or designated or official boundaries. And anyone who keeps Shabbat knows this to be true. If you put restrictions on yourself on Shabbat, then you feel Shabbat to be a different kind of day, a different kind of reality. And so there's something about Shabbat that, even though some of these formulations are unreasonable, what does it mean if I get dropped in the middle of nowhere? I just have to stay there until Shabbat. But that position is a way of giving a voice to this idealized, perfection-oriented Shabbat as a spiritual institution that can create a new reality. And once I start messing with that, I begin to lose that state of that spiritual space. So on the other hand, you have this other value, which is basic human need and enjoyment. And the rabbis are concerned with that. The whole idea of an Eruv is to start accommodating to human need. We've been saying that all along. So there is, in all of these Shabbat laws, this will be our last kind of Shabbat class. And so it's good that we've circled around this theme again and again and again. But it's good that once again, we're returning to this basic tension on Shabbat between that ideal spiritual state, which requires a certain kind of absurd commitment. Like, why do I not work on the seventh day? There's no real rational reason for that. It's a spiritual reason, which, if I commit to it, creates a spiritual reality. So take a look. This is very much in the spirit of what Leah was just saying, that that last right. Some of the rabbis said you can walk about the entire city, and others say you only have 4 cubits. So here's an example, but it's not a city, it's a boat. There was an incident where all of these sages, all of the ones we just mentioned, were coming from Pelandarsin, and their boat set sail on the sea on Shabbat, and the boat drifted beyond 2,000 cubits, right? So technically, on the boat, they've gone beyond their limit. So Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah walked about the entire boat because they hold that the entire boat is considered like 4 cubits. It's all personal. Let's be reasonable here. We don't really expect people to stay in one standing position for 24 hours. That's ridiculous. They have to actually be able to enjoy the Shabbat. But Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Akiva did not move beyond 4 cubits as they sought to be stringent with themselves. Okay? And that language here tells you that's not really the law. The law, or at least the rabbinic law, is to create accommodation, is to allow you to move about in some reasonable way so that you can flee from enemies or dine with your neighbors or move about in some reasonable way on Shabbat. But there's another instinct in the tradition that some of the rabbis are really attached to, that no, let's be strict. We have to be careful not to let the boundaries of Shabbat get too loose, because then we lose the whole sense of Shabbat. Okay, so that is really in some ways one of the central tensions in Shabbat. Is Shabbat there for us to enjoy, and therefore we have to legislate sometimes even around or through Shabbat, the laws of Shabbat, in order to create that space of safety, enjoyment, comfort, pleasure? Or is Shabbat in itself so unreasonable, but that's part of the point, that we commit to a certain unreasonable standard so that we can experience this different kind of consciousness. And even if it's inconvenient sometimes, it allows us to have this special space, this special day. Now, with that said, the last thing that I want to look at with you today is, of course, what is the most, we've been studying Shabbat together now for a few weeks. What is the most obvious, and it's not even a loophole, it is part of the rules of Shabbat, that you can violate Shabbat for one big reason, and that is to save a life, or for any kind of health reason. You're always allowed to break Shabbat for a health reason. So when we think about these boundaries of Shabbat, well, there too, if you need to drive to a hospital or walk to a hospital that's far, far away, so then, of course, you can do that. And take a look at the formulation of this last Mishnah that we're going to look at. One who was permitted to leave, and that means one who was allowed to go because they were attending to some medical need, helping someone else get to some doctor. But they said to him along the way, the action has already been performed. There's someone else has brought the doctor closer. All right, there's some reason why they no longer have to go. And yet they've already gone a long direction. So that person now has 2,000 cubits in each direction. Remember, the law was if you got plopped in the middle of nowhere, you only have 4 cubits. But if you're in the middle of nowhere for some health reason, then you have that 2,000 cubits. And of course, if he was within his original limit, is considered as if he had not left. For all who go out to save lives may return to their original locations on Shabbat. Okay, so that should be obvious to us. Whenever there's something very strict, I just wanted you to see that comparison, something very strict about if you find yourself in the middle of nowhere for reasons, unforeseen reasons, then the law says you should be very strict about your movement. But if you had to go into the middle of nowhere for that basic human concern of saving a life, then the rabbis give you a lot more movement, okay? That shouldn't surprise us. I want to just end in these last couple of minutes with this idea, something that Joni said at the beginning, which is that Shabbat is not, the boundaries of Shabbat are practical, but they're also spiritual in a way. They also define the limits of the community. And Kathy built on this a little bit too. The very idea of having some kind of container that keeps the community together isn't just about observing the laws of Shabbat, but also about creating a sense of communal solidarity. And with that in mind, I want to end with one of one of the most heartbreaking and beautiful stories of the most famous heretic in the Talmud, Elisha ben Abuya, who saw enough bad things happening to good people that he lost his faith in God. And he was a great sage. He was one of the greatest sages, but he abandoned the faith and becomes this sort of interesting figure in the Talmud. They refer to him as Acher, the other, the one who crossed over. And one of the most beautiful things, he's a fascinating figure. There's a lot of stories of him in the Talmud. One of the most beautiful parts of his story is that he had a student, Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Meir, even after his teacher became an apostate, he didn't leave his teacher behind. He still considered his teacher to be a sage. So take a look. This is just one snippet from the life of Acher, this famous heretic, and his student Rabbi Meir. And as it happens, this story also deals with the idea of Techum Shabbat, which, if nothing else this hour, I wanted you to just know about the concept of Techum Shabbat, because it'll come up again. And this story is an example of where that knowledge will come in handy. So let's just end on this story. And I think the story makes Joni's point again in an incredibly heartbreaking way. So our rabbis taught a story about Acher. Once he was riding a horse on Shabbat. Now that's already forbidden. So you can tell he's left the faith. But Rabbi Meir was walking after him in order to learn Torah from his mouth. Okay, so that already is like, we could spend another hour just talking about what does it mean that one of these great rabbis stayed in the faith, but still considered his heretical teacher to be worthy of learning from. But then even more beautiful is that Acher said to him, Meir, turn back now, because I've already measured by my horse's steps that this is the boundary line for Shabbat travel. There's that phrase, Techum Shabbat. Okay, so we're traveling and I don't care because I don't keep Shabbat anymore, but you do. So you, my student, you need to stay back. So it's just a beautiful illustration of how even those who are not observant sometimes will attend to the observance of others, right? The Talmud is even acknowledging that. But then Rabbi Meir says, well, you too, you turn back. But of course, he doesn't just mean turn back within the borders of Shabbat. He means come back, be a part of the community again. And Acher says, no, it's too late for me. Haven't I already told you? I heard from behind the curtain. That's like a phrase meaning like, I heard mystical secrets, that the verse, return you wayward children, applies to everyone except for me. So sometimes you're just too far gone. So that's like, that story uses this concept of Techum Shabbat, of like the boundary lines of a community, how far you can go before you're sort of seen to be beyond the pale, beyond the community, beyond the boundary line, to mean something that is very practical, that is very much about keeping a community together in a physical way. It uses that boundary line to reflect on something much more spiritual, and in this case, tragic, which is the ways that our different orientations to Judaism itself can sometimes estrange us and alienate us from one another. And here you have two men that are desperately seeking to honor one another and to continue to be in community with one another, even when their visions of the laws are now radically different. I want to just end by saying on that note that that I'm grateful for this community. Grateful. I don't know where Leah and Randy are, but I think are they here in the States? Are you still here? Yeah. And just so I'm grateful to have Randy as new full member of the Jewish people of this community, and may you all and all of us always remain in these boundaries. So good to learn with you all, and I'll see you again next week. Sorry for the 2 weeks of interruption, but we're back on. I'll see you again next Monday.
Thank you. Thank you.
Adios.